Oh, I'm also not sharing the screen, so I'm referencing the syllabus, but not even showing it to you. Well, good thing I said the date. So again, final question paper, now you should see it. Final question paper due on the 30th. It is a second completely new, unique question paper. The extra credit question paper, you can earn up to 50 points. I will be grading them, the extra credit question papers. So put that energy into it. It's not just free points, essentially, is what I'm saying. So you won't get feedback on the extra credit one. So for the final question paper, honestly, I'm probably going to be grading the question papers these couple days, May 5th and 6th. So you probably will receive feedback around those days. If I'm able to do it earlier, I will. Yeah, so you will receive feedback on your final question paper that will hopefully help you in your writing going on to future classes. And then your extra credit paper, you won't get feedback on that other than just see points applied to your gradebook. So questions with question papers or the extra credit question paper at all? All right, I don't see any hands. So, all right. Well, let's get jumping into chapter 16, and we probably won't finish with chapter 16 today, but we'll get a good way through it. So let's get to that. So chapter 16, the first thing I want to do is review some theories that we've talked about throughout the class. So Erikson's theory, we've talked about Erikson's at different points and your book has focused on Erikson's as well as things like Piaget in a lot more detail than we have here in class. But Erikson did have some aspects of the theory that went all the way to the end of lifespan. So Erikson thought the kind of crisis or challenge here in late adulthood for late adults was identity integrity versus despair. So whether you either reflected on your past and pieced it together in a positive framework or conclude that your life hasn't been well spent. And then at this point, there's, for Erikson, maybe not a whole lot of time to give back and be generative. But this follows along really well with what we've seen from Erikson's theories of identity generally, that some aspects of his theory towards the end here are a lot of it around identity development. And that now we know, yes, identity can and does change, is more fluid than previously thought. And so this integrity versus despair, we see now as not so much of a crisis, not so much of a big challenge or a crisis, but as something that people tend to do is reflect on their life, look on have they been consistent or inconsistent, what kind of person they are, and seeing if they've had a positive view of their life in general or a negative view of their life in general. Maybe they decide to make some changes in late adulthood even. So this involves life review, so looking back at those experiences. So this is commonly done through identity development. You might not schedule out in a calendar and plan, hey, I'm going to review my life on Friday this week. But this is something that people tend to do as they're thinking about themselves, thinking about their identity and who they are, and evaluate themselves. So this is not just for late adulthood, but it is a key feature of late adulthood as well. Interestingly, life review is actually a type of research method that we use as well. So there's a narrative life interview where basically we ask people of any age to essentially tell us their story of their life. We might ask them to focus on one or two like events at different time periods through life, but try to get them while we're talking with them in an interview format of their own life experiences, evaluating them, coming to who they are now, what their goals are for the future. This is actually the kind of research method we're using with heroes right now to get a sense, because it's it's really difficult to do any kind of longitudinal study with heroes, because it's really kind of random if you will encounter a situation where you have to act heroically or not. So we're asking these heroes to look at their life, and we're actually finding some really interesting commonalities between heroes' lives. The people who take physical action, there's not so much in common between them in their early childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, but there's a lot of similarities we're seeing from people who were like whistleblowers. A lot of our participants have been whistleblowers, looking at their life, family structures, parent structures, challenges their parents had, messages their parents delivered to them, messages that they internalized in early adulthood, are all very similar. It's really interesting. So that's the cutting edge of research on heroism right now, is these interviews that we're doing. It's pretty interesting. With that, though, life review is something that people do throughout identity development. So it's not just a thing. Erikson focused on it here at the end of life, and that it was a challenge or a crisis for people, but it is something that starts around early adolescence and mid-adolescence and continues on throughout life. It does hold different context or importance for late adults because they feel like they're nearing the end of their life, so it might be done in a little different way than previously in their life. All right, another thing that can be done is reminiscence therapy, essentially sitting with a therapist and explicitly doing a life review. The therapist helping you discuss past activities and experiences. You might do this in a group type of setting as well. So that is called reminiscence therapy. And so just kind of helping scaffold or support someone in this life review process. So as we're talking about Erikson, we just talked about this ego identity versus despair. And the main question there, have you lived a full life, being kind of the crisis Erikson thought about. But Erikson has all these different stages at different points of life. So this is Erikson's theory of lifespan development, that we kind of have to get these critical crises solved at this point in life before moving on to the next one. So hopefully you remember some of these. Trust versus mistrust, being can a child, I accidentally scrolled around. Can a child trust their caregivers? Is our world safe? In early childhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Can they do things by themselves? Are they starting to gain these kinds of capacities? Later on, initiative versus guilt. Are they a good person? Are they making choices within probably a school context or around other peers their age that can make choices in their environment and affect other people? School age, we have industry versus inferiority. In adolescence, like I just mentioned, we have identity versus role confusion. Then young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. For Erikson, a lot of that is forming an intimate relationship with a partner, but later researchers have also taken that for friends as well. Then in middle adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. We talked a lot about this throughout middle adulthood. And then ego identity versus despair. So these were the things Erikson felt were some of the most important pieces of the lifespan. Here's it all together. It's a ton of text, but hopefully our quick review made it a little less overwhelming to see this all together. And you can see that in infancy, early childhood, preschool, school age, there's a lot of stages Erikson described in a childhood versus adolescence. You've got one stage. Early adulthood to maybe the beginning of middle adulthood, you've got one stage, and then late adulthood, you've got one stage. So it goes to show what the researchers were focusing on at the time that Erikson was doing this work, a lot of focus on early childhood. Erikson was not the only one to focus on late adulthood, but one of few to be looking at the whole lifespan. So that there are critical, important things happening to late adults. And these were the things that were most important to Erikson, or that he thought were most important across the lifespan. So we've also talked about other theories. This is a good review also for your final exam. You might be asked questions about maybe industry versus inferiority or autonomy versus shame and doubt, things like that. So it's all here on one slide, a quick review for that. But we've also talked about other theories. So we've got the periods of development. So think about what was, as we talked about research, as we went through the chapters, what were the most important things that we discussed in the prenatal stage or phase. Stage would fit for prenatal, infancy, early childhood, middle to late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood. What are things you think we should have focused on more, or we focus on too much, or the research focuses on too much? So think about those things right now, because it'll be relevant for our group activity in just a second. So another theory that we've talked about, and this is one of the primary theories that's used. So systems theories are currently the biggest overarching theory winner, I guess you could say, within developmental psychology. So one of these is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of human development, and it's a systems theory looking at systems in this specific way, that there's a microsystem where individuals are interacting with at any time. So for an infant, they probably don't have a school yet or necessarily friends, but their parents are their microsystem. At any time, they're living in a place with certain economic systems or governments or industries, political systems. So this is the exosystem, and the connections between those, that's the mesosystem. Then the macrosystem is the norms and values of the culture. So does the culture in Sri Lanka versus Hawaii versus, I'm just trying to, in my mind, jump to different places on the map, versus France, versus Australia, versus the US, versus Brazil. Do the norms and values of the culture change the exosystems differently? And then do those change the microsystems and affect that individual? So that's one systems theory, or one model based on systems theory. Another model based on systems theory, developmental systems theory, is Lerner's developmental systems theory and model here. So relational developmental systems is the overarching umbrella of what the meta theory is, and some descriptions of it are Bronfenbrenner's and then Lerner's. So I favor Lerner's model. I think the focus here on the plasticity, the bidirectional interactions, is a little more clear than it is in Bronfenbrenner's, but there are other researchers who really favor Bronfenbrenner's that are doing similar works, and it's not like we're fighting at conferences or things. They're just referencing Bronfenbrenner and tying things back to that work or this model and theory, but really we're still working on the same theory. It's just two different ways to look at the theory. So this is one thing I've talked about a lot in this class, because I feel like when I was in my undergrad, I didn't have a good sense of what the overarching developmental theories were. I learned a lot of random facts about development, just as you've learned a lot of facts about development, but I didn't feel like I had even a little bit of an understanding of the frameworks that were currently used in the field. So I try to impart this to you over the course of the semester, that these systems theories are really what developmental researchers are using. And this is the framework that we're thinking in. Because remember, a theory is this broad overarching way to describe and incorporate a lot of data. So we incorporate our thinking on attachment, on relationships, on emotions and personality. We incorporate that all under this idea that systems are interacting with other systems. So children with parents, parents with work, parents and children all within their culture, these kinds of things. So when I went into grad school and I realized how big of a thing this was, some of the other students, as we read the first articles I read on these topics, were like, oh yeah, I already know this stuff. And I was like, I'm super lost. So that's why I like to try and drill it into your heads a little more, so you understand where the field is right now, especially if you continue on with developmental work, that you understand this is the perspective we use. So another example of a model that really does fit well under systems theory is developmental cascades. The idea that because of plasticity, because of risk factors and protective factors. At any time, we can try and help people get towards thriving versus not thriving. So you might say on the right side of this picture is really good outcomes or positive outcomes. On the left side is maybe negative outcomes. So at any point, you might have certain protective factors or risk factors, or make choices that bounce you one way or the other, just like a molecule of water might start going over here and then end up all the way over here. So that's developmental cascades, or the idea of behind that model. And we've referenced this quite a few times. So as you think about theories, hopefully you're remembering some of these points. You can apply it to some of the facts that we've learned throughout the semester. Hopefully you can think of some things that are maybe important, like I said, that you don't feel like we've touched on enough in any of these life phases. Now the last one I'll mention is, I think this is the last one. Oh, Piaget is next. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. So we focused on the zone of proximal development, but the sociocultural theory is essentially that, well, the social and cultural environment around you is going to be training you and moving you in different directions. So if math is important in your sociocultural environment, that's something you're going to learn. That's a tool that you're going to learn in that environment. If English or Spanish is important in that environment, it's going to teach you that and train you in that area. If certain emotion regulation techniques are important, it's going to pull you that way to teach you those or not teach you those. So with that, we focus mostly on the zone of proximal development, the idea that a person is capable of things. With help, they can do more things. And so this scaffolding is important in early childhood all the way through adolescence, as well as late adulthood. As we talked about, you might still be needing to scaffold late adults in training certain cognitive skills. They can even be mentors and scaffold other people. But that having scaffolding to build capacities that they want to build can be really useful for them. So here we've got a lot of focus on social interactions, parents, friends, mentors, peers, friends and peers, similar. Then we've got Piaget's theory, the stages of cognitive development. And we've talked about how Piaget really didn't think there was much cognitive change after about adolescence, which hopefully seems a little ridiculous to you now, as we've talked about cognitive changes and neurological changes over the lifespan. So sensory motor stage, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And that's not to say that Piaget was bad, but it was really the beginning of the field looking at cognitive development. Later researchers added post-formal thought as an adult cognitive developmental feature, but that wasn't Piaget himself, that was others after him. So this stage-like theory, Erikson's was very stage-like. You either managed and survived those crises at different times of your life, or you were kind of stuck there. We didn't really talk about Freud's lifespan development theories, but it was very stage-like as well. If you didn't overcome certain challenges at a certain time, you would be stuck there also. I think your book does mention it a little more. But yeah, that brings us to our class activity. So remember, a theory is these overarching ideas that we can use to describe the data we have, the research that we have, to predict things that might happen based on our understanding. So it's the big, broad ideas. So think of what might be some critical components to your own theory of lifespan development. What's most important to you? Do you think there should be a bigger focus on biology, bigger focus on cognition? Is the self most important? Are relationships, whether it's with peers or other people? So what's most important, you think, across the lifespan? It might be things we've already talked about that you're like, oh yeah, Bronfenbrenner's, that's great, I'll just stick with that. Or you might say, hey, I would want to see more of a focus on this within that frame. Or you might want to have your own stage-like theory. So make sure whatever points that you're talking about are relevant across the lifespan. So it shouldn't, when we're thinking about a lifespan development theory, the theory shouldn't only apply to, say, childhood or only adolescence or only late adulthood. The things that are most important should apply at all times. And so what are the main pieces you would include? What would you include in your theory of lifespan development? So I'm basically going to turn off my microphone and basically shut my camera cover and let you all discuss this, whether it's you're turning on your cameras or you are doing a chat. But we'll stay in this room because we don't have enough students, I think, to break off into smaller groups. But talk together about what are pieces that you would want included, um, pieces of theories you might bring. Maybe you'd start from scratch. So think about these broad overarching ideas that are important across the lifespan. And so how would that go into your own theory? So any questions before I turn off my mic? I'll still be here, but you won't see me. So any questions before you do that discussion?
I don't have any.
All right, well, get to it. We'll be back in the, I'm still available for questions too, since I'm listening in. So feel free to continue asking me questions as you go through, but I'll basically try to let you be on your own, and then we'll come back at 10:35. And if that doesn't seem like it's going to be enough time, or if that's too long, I'll jump in and let you know. But plan to discuss this and then be back at 10:35.
I don't know if you guys can hear me, so let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I don't know. I like the kind of idea of like having the periods of development into the theory just because it kind of sections off everything easily, but I feel like we evolve a lot, so it also adds to like the evolution of while we're growing up and learning and changing. I don't know, but I do think that we have to look more into it because each person is different, so it's kind of hard to designate what is happening where. But I think the more specific the theory would be, the better. Yeah.
All right, we're coming up on 10:35, so let's jump back as a group. Well, I guess I'll jump back in rather than hiding and spying. Um, I think a lot of the focus here has been on if I'm trying to incorporate it. So basically, we've got comments of people talking about their own things that they would focus on and what they feel is important. Not as much discussion about like incorporating different people's ideas together as one theory as I was hoping for, though. So definitely one thing that I see pretty common throughout a lot of these is that individual experience is going to be different. So everybody develops differently. So people have different connections throughout their life. And that while we might even make stages and format this theory in a stage-like thing, not everybody is going to necessarily follow those stages. So there's a lot of individual difference I feel is important, is one thing that's coming through in all the things that you students feel are important in a developmental theory, which I think is really great. The individual focus is, let's go back to the slides. An individual focus is one reason that I like seeing the individual at the center, and so near the center in these two models, for example. Now, that being said, there are some things that these two models don't do as well as some of the comments that were made. So obviously these are not stage-like theories at all. These are looking more at continuous development and acknowledging that there are some stage-like aspects of development. There was one other thing someone said, cognitive development. So cognition is in here, just this little tiny triangle in both of these. Whereas in some ways you could see it as a larger part of socio-emotional relationships, and that building cognitive development might be more important in some ways than focusing on other aspects of a person's development. And you might include that or have that be a bigger piece. If you were to model yours after Lerner's or Bronfenbrenner's, which way? This way is Bronfenbrenner's. So they have age, sex, health, etc. So cognition's in there somewhere. I would take for mine, or to kind of incorporate yours, if we took Bronfenbrenner's, made it stage-like, focused on cognition, I'd maybe take this circle of the child with all these different aspects together and put it into the middle there. And then I would maybe in this chrono system have this be different stages, is what it sounds like. And that's how I might incorporate a lot of the ideas you were just sharing. So hopefully this activity, with that, are there any other comments that you'd want to make based on what I just said, or to try and tie things together, or questions about theory in general? And feel free to either type it or take over the microphone as well. So clarifications of your points that I might have misinterpreted or anything like that. All right. Well, hopefully doing this activity at least made you think about the important aspects of lifespan development. So across the lifespan, what is the most important? What are things that are consistent all the way across the lifespan? Thinking if it's important to have stages or have something where you've got the systems interacting with each other. So hopefully this is reminding you of the lectures we had in chapters like 1 and 2. As one, that information will be on the final, and two, we start with those pieces because it kind of goes through the entire semester. And so we definitely don't have time to jump back and re-review those whole chapters. Sometimes I feel that like that could be a really useful thing for students to go back and review chapters like 1 and 2, where we start talking about what are theories, what are the theories we're using, what are research methods, and those kinds of things. All right. Well, with that being said, let's move into some aspects of socio-emotional development in late adulthood. So, activity theory, it should sound really familiar to you. We've been mentioning it and kind of alluding to it at many different points in middle adulthood as well, and you'll see why. Activity theory is the idea that the more active and involved an older person is, the more likely they're going to be satisfied with their lives. So especially when we look at longitudinal as well as cross-sectional data, people who continue those same roles that they had in middle adulthood through to the end of their life, they are more likely to be satisfied, they're more likely to be happy, have meaning, well-being, good thriving things, have better health for longer, have more relationships or deeper relationships that they're more satisfied with. So with that, there might be times when you can't do certain activities anymore. Let's say this couple who's dancing, maybe one of them breaks their hip and they're not able to dance anymore. Well, they can substitute that role or substitute that activity for something else. Maybe they can organize these dance competitions. Maybe they can still train and teach and support other people who are learning to dance. Just a really direct comparison, but they could completely replace that activity with something else. We'll watch a couple videos in a minute of people who substitute roles and activities based on the physical challenges that they have. So for anyone who's not able to do what they were before, they can substitute and keep being active. The big thing is to increase the things that you're doing. And so oftentimes we talked about this in a sense of leisure activities. So do more leisure activities, get out and do more, but this can be work as well, whether it's paid work or something for a hobby, like being involved in a community. Those are some of the best things, just keeping being and doing things and being alive to live longer, essentially. So before we talk about socio-emotional selectivity theory, I'm going to skip forward and pull up that video that I was just mentioning. Because I have it in here. I'm near the end of chapter 16. But I really feel like we should talk about it right now and watch this video right now. There we go. That's the one I want. All right, so let's watch this together, and it's really relevant to activity theory and a lot of the aspects of socio-emotional development we're going to be talking about today.
Just a drop of water, and it never talks back to you. That's what I like about it. If you're taking pictures of people, they talk back. Is my hair just right? Am I posed right? Which is my better side? Water never says anything. It keeps quiet and drops. I was always interested in photography. I've probably taken pictures longer, I've taken more pictures than anybody in the whole world. After all, I'll be 102, and I started taking pictures at the age of 8. That makes 94 years of picture taking. That's a lot of pictures in a long time.
After a century, Irving Olsen is still learning new tricks. He uses the latest technology to capture nature's tiniest details, from the shape of a water drop to an insect's gaze.
Nature needs me. It can't operate without me. It would never get publicity. I love difficult pictures like this one here.
And just as he's found a formula for his photographs, he's also developed a formula for living as long as he has.
It's a 3-part formula. It's very simple. If you count to 3, you can live to 100. First part of the formula, 50%. You have to have the right spouse. If you have the right spouse, you're halfway there. 45%, everything in moderation. You don't sleep too much, don't eat too much. Do everything just exactly right. Now, there's 5% less if you've been following me. That 5% is very difficult, but for me, it's easy. Would you like to know what it is? I thought you'd never ask. Anyway, I'll tell you what it is. You do not, under any circumstances, take any crap from anyone.
At the University of Arizona and elsewhere, researchers are...
So we'll keep watching this, but definitely look at that person's attitude, their personality, their humor, some of their character strengths, and consider, especially as we go and talk about personality traits and how they're correlated or not correlated with longer life, see if you can think back to this person as an example and match them to some of these personality traits. So when I'm talking about personality traits, I'm talking about the big five, and we'll come up to this. We'll probably get to this today. So here those are again: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Which of these would you say this person is scoring high on versus low on? And then in a little bit, we'll look at some correlations with those things and look at the activities that these people are doing as well.
Interested in Irving's formula and Irving himself. They're studying the oldest people among us to learn the secrets of successful aging.
People who are able to maintain high levels of cognitive ability as they age throughout the course of their lifespan can be considered as having achieved successful aging. It's really being able to maintain how you functioned all your life as you age, and not having major changes or declines in your cognitive ability as some people can experience. Looking at successful aging, we're really trying to understand why some people are able to do really well as they age and others not.
Genes play an important role, but researchers are learning that other factors may matter just as much. Staying active, eating well, and sleeping enough have all been associated with longer, healthier lives. What may matter most is something that's hard to measure: how we engage with the world.
There are some good associational studies that have shown that being engaged, being socially connected is beneficial to your cognitive health and your outcome over life. It goes hand in hand with your cognitive health, is to be emotionally engaged and happy and feeling fulfilled. And those kinds of aspects are just as important in terms of experiencing a good, successful quality of life as you age. It's projected that the elderly community will double over the next several decades. So this is going to become an increasingly important issue, that we understand what are the benefits and what are the causes of difficulties as we age, because there are going to be more and more people who are going to be experiencing these problems. So it's not only a problem for the individual or the family or the community, but it's also a huge public health issue.
Let's say thanks for redoing our webpage.
Activist Marian Lupu has always believed that this public health issue demands public action. Almost 50 years ago, she founded the organization that would become the Pima Council on Aging, to give more people a chance to age successfully.
When I started, our only service was one nursing home in the community. Most of the social agencies did not serve the elderly.
Since then, Marian has seen services grow and attitudes change, but she still recognizes societal obstacles to aging well.
In some cultures, aging has a much more reverence than we do here. And I don't know that reverence for the elderly really is as important as just teaching people at a very early age that there will be disabilities and how they overcome them. If we could develop relationships with young people for them to recognize that they will grow old, and what do they want in the community to be there when they are old, and what is it that we need to put in the society that are supports.
Now 90 years old, Marian has her own definition of successful aging.
To me, success is not wishing that you wouldn't be here tomorrow morning, that you would just close your eyes and go away. To me, successful aging is for the person to enjoy the latter stages of their life. And of course, that means, from my perspective solely, is that you have to find what it is that gives you kicks.
Irving Olson has no doubt about what gives him kicks, and no plans to stop searching for the next thing that makes his life worth living.
Now, since it's so hard to get around, I can't walk all day like I used to. Now it's simple. I just stand over a tray of water, drop water in, and I've got pictures. That's my latest thing. Next year, I hope to have a new kind of hobby going. I haven't picked it yet, but I'll have something new.
So I like those two examples a lot because they're both very different. One person is really, really engaged in their community. They've, for 50 years, been doing activism for people who are older adults. And so they're involved, they're still in their 90s, directly involved with the management of that organization that they've created, versus we see the other person, they're very involved in doing their hobbies. And like they said, they have photography right now. Next year, they'll probably have something new. They haven't picked it yet. And you can see their attitudes towards aging, that they, especially when they said, well, successful aging by one's definition was that you wouldn't just want to not be here, but that you'd be enjoying life. And so that's what researchers are trying to get at and figure out too, partially because there is this bigger population of people that are going to be in late adulthood, but also because so many people, I mean, unless they die earlier, will be late adults. So it's a big part of human development. So if we can thrive from childhood, in adolescence, in early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood, I think that's a really worthy goal as a lifespan developmental psychologist. So hopefully you can think back to these two examples as we go through the literature and some of these facts that we're going to be discussing today, as well as at the end of life as well. So activity theory, the more active you are, the more involved, the more likely you're going to be satisfied with your life. Being engaged in your organization that you've built from the ground up and kept running for 50 years. I can't think of a better example of engagement than that. Having a hobby that you're really directly connected to. It's very active. So this also leads to other aspects of socio-emotional health and the people that you interact with and are involved with. So socio-emotional selectivity theory is one discussed in your book, and this is the idea that, well, we do see stats. We do see that older adults' networks shrink as they get older. So part of that might just be because of aging and dying. So let's just make up a random number, let's say 30. Say they have a network of 30 people, and then it shrinks to 20 because 10 of them died. Socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests that maybe some of the reason that we see this network shrinking might be because they're spending more time with individuals who they have the most rewarding relationships with. So if you have those 30 people, maybe 15 of those people you have a really rewarding relationship with. So you focus on those 15 rather than the whole 30. And so that takes less energy for yourself, just like the man, he's not able to walk around as much, so he doesn't go out to take pictures as much. He uses the energy on things that he can do. So trying to replace activities with other activities. So you're focusing your energy on the relationships that are the most meaningful to you. So with this suggests that maybe the fact that networks are shrinking is not necessarily leading to loneliness or despair. It might just be a choice selecting where you're going to put your energy. That being said, while we do have some evidence for the selectivity theory, doesn't seem like it's true for everyone, that for some people their network might be shrinking for other reasons. So for whatever reason, some of the most important things are to focus your energy on in late adulthood are things that are meaningful to you, meaningful goals. So keeping your organization running. So doing your photos, meeting with your family, volunteering, fostering inclusion in communities, working and mentoring younger people. All these kinds of things could be very meaningful goals for a late adult. So with this, let's talk about some of the priorities that adults report at different stages of life. So here we've got, and they're all color coded. So work is kind of this green color, family is this blue color. It's a little different between some of these, but hopefully you can follow the priorities. So when asked, like, how would you prioritize these things? Which would you rank higher than the others? You should look at some trends for a second here, and then I'll comment on some things. All right, so hopefully you've noticed a few things already just on your own. One is work, that maybe in early adulthood, work tends to be a really high priority. It becomes a little less important through middle adulthood. Then as we get to later middle adulthood, it's not even on the list as the years go on. A family is maybe not as important in early adulthood to many people, but then it's very important until we get to late adulthood, where health beats out family. So we can see here that maybe this is where people are starting to be concerned about their health. Maybe they're starting to recognize some deterioration. And at this point, at 85, they're losing some physical capacities. They're trying to maintain some things. So it becomes of primary importance. Friends being pretty important still across time. And then friends maybe dropping off of that importance. It might be the next one we don't have on this graph, the next thing in line, which I think would be interesting. But also maybe some of those friends are also dying at this point in life. Might lead to those kinds of changes. We see cognitive fitness being of pretty high importance. If you're thinking of the 4 most important things in these people's lives, cognitive fitness, it's interesting that we see it as one of these most important things, versus independence doesn't really exist as one of the important things later on. So hopefully you can see those trends, and it helps you make connections to things we talked about in early adulthood, middle adulthood, and now in late adulthood as well. That's the priorities people have. All right, so this all also ties into selective optimization with compensation theory. So basically this is a theory that looks at successful aging as looking at selection, optimization of certain things, and compensation on certain things. So selection. Older adults might be losing capacity in certain areas. We mentioned earlier the example of breaking a hip and not being able to walk or dance anymore. So maybe they're reducing that capacity to walk, or they're reducing their eye capacity, or their hearing capacity. So there's a reduced performance in a lot of physical capacities by late adulthood. Cognitive faculties, though, tend not to be reducing. So that's relevant to optimization. So older adults need to think about, what are they going to optimize? Are they going to go to physical therapy to get back some of their walking ability, or are they going to focus instead on something else? Are they going to optimize their cognitive abilities? I mean, you could probably tell from our discussions, my plan, I mean, I'm a little ways away from late adulthood, but my plan is to, maybe for myself, focus on some of these cognitive faculties as I'm continuing to age, and optimizing those rather than physical capacities. That at a certain point, it's going to be, to me, it feels like maybe a losing battle. And then that goes into compensation. You might need to compensate for certain tasks. Does that mean you need family help, a live-in nurse, a nursing home? Do you need a wheelchair? Do you need a motorized wheelchair? So how are you going to compensate for these life tasks? So selective optimization with compensation is, what are you going to select to optimize, and then where do you need compensation? Older adults are going to be thinking about this with their life reviewing, but they can also be supported through it. So it can be an area where they can be scaffolded by therapists, healthcare professionals, family members as well, talking about the challenges and maybe providing or offering tools. So it's really easy to find good neurological tools if you ask a neurologist, hey, what are some good neurological tools that I could use to optimize working memory or something like that? You might get some good answers from Google as well. So let's jump to that topic of personality. So hopefully our video and that discussion, it reminded you of a few things about personality. So again, we have these big 5 traits. So openness, and each of these is on a spectrum. So you've got someone who could be very, very open or not very open at all, and a whole range in between there. So conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Are there any of these that you need a quick definition for before we talk about some correlations with these through the lifespan in late adulthood? Like if you look at this and you're like, oh no, I don't at all remember what this one is. And that'd be a good question. All right, so hopefully you're remembering all the aspects of the big five. So if we look at conscientiousness, so high conscientiousness predicts lower mortality risk from childhood all the way through late adulthood. So across the lifespan, we see that people who score high on conscientiousness also tend to live a longer life. They have lower mortality risk and higher lifespan. So that's a correlation. There are things you can do to work to change someone's personality, but since it is kind of broad overarching characteristics, it's a hard experiment to say change someone's personality and see how that changes. So most of this is correlational research. So we see a correlation when you're high on conscientiousness. So imagine my arm here is the line in a graph. So when you're high in conscientiousness, you're also high in lifespan, or you tend to be. It's a correlation there. And maybe there are some causal variables there. If you're a conscientious person, maybe you are more conscientious of your health behaviors throughout your lifespan. Maybe you're more conscientious of not taking undue risks. Maybe you're more conscientious to get to your appointments on time or take your vitamins and things like that. So high neuroticism, so that's this one over here. So if you're highly neurotic, you probably have lots of emotional instability. So someone with a disorder like borderline personality disorder, for example, maybe not a good example because we didn't actually really talk about that in this class, but that would probably be a good example of someone who would probably score high on neuroticism. So high neuroticism is linked to negative emotions. So there is a positive correlation. When you're high in neuroticism, you tend to have more negative emotions. And it's also predicting higher frailty. There might be some causal relationships here as well. If you are more emotionally unstable, maybe it's harder for you to interact with other people and keep good, secure friendships. So maybe when you having this emotional instability, maybe you're having more negative emotions because of that as well. And you're maybe having generally a lower quality of life. So there might be some other variables in there leading to these relationships. If we look at conscientiousness again, it's linked to that longer life, as well as a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. So those people who are more conscientious, probably again, the relationship here is that those who are conscientious are paying more attention to their health, their cognitive health, they're noticing things and maybe catching them early on so they can get it treated. So that might be one causal relationship stemming from conscientiousness and the behaviors you might predict. So when we know these things about a people, their personality traits, if we know your 70% openness and 70% conscientiousness, 40% extroversion, 20% agreeableness, and 60% neuroticism, it's probably a pretty unlikely breakdown actually. But let's say we know all those things. You might be able to predict some of these things fairly generally, like that they might have a longer or shorter lifespan. They have a higher or lower risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So if you've ever read a 23andMe report of your genetic risk, like you might have increased risk of this disease or disorder, you might have reduced risk. It's the same kind of thing we can get from these broad variables. When you think of these 5 and they're on a spectrum, that's really just kind of 10 variables there to predict a lot of things. So we can get these kind of broad predictions, but we can't really narrow it down too much more detailed than that. So that's why some of its predictive energy is useful, like this. And then we can know, well, let's actually look at a couple correlations more. So high levels of agreeableness and low levels of neuroticism. So you've got 2 things at the same time. You've got high agreeableness, low neuroticism. You'll be less likely to develop dementia. So you might be able to consider examples of a person who might be highly agreeable and not very neurotic, so pretty emotionally stable, and why that might lead to less likelihood of dementia. So this one's interesting. So high levels of conscientiousness, openness to experience, agreeableness, and extroversion. So high on all of these things. When you have high scores on all of those, it's really correlated with positive emotions. And you might imagine that being the case. If you're very open to things, if you're very conscientious, if you're very extroverted, if you're very agreeable, you might have lots more positive experiences than someone who's opposite on all of those. So that's something that we can predict, is those positive emotions. So going back to my example earlier, we might be able to make these kind of broad predictions of someone, but it's hard with these broad personality traits to say, hey, in this specific situation at this nursing home, if we put this person with these scores into this nursing home, are they going to have positive outcomes or negative outcomes? That kind of specific prediction is going to be difficult with these really broad characteristics. But it still is really useful to see these things. Because if we see, well, hey, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, those are all related to positive emotions, we can then investigate what is the actual causal relationship there. Why are there more positive emotions? What is the other variables we're not looking at that kind of link these all together? And then if we figure that out, maybe we can help all these people have more of what they need to have more thriving and positive emotions in their life. So it is really useful for those kinds of things. It's one step in the broader system of trying to figure out people and their own individual differences and incorporating that all together. All right, so kind of a positive thing that we were talking about there, now to maybe a more negative thing. So stereotyping in adulthood. So ageism is a prejudice against another person because of their age. So we might have mentioned ageism, like that word, and referenced it in adolescence, because this is another place we often see ageism. Oftentimes adolescents are not considered as capable as they actually are. So an adult or a boss or a community member might not give much credence to the ideas of an adolescent because they're so young. Same kind of thing happens with a lot of older people. They face ageism. So this is the prejudice because of their age. So this leads to a lot of perceptions about older people that are incorrect. So one idea is that they're incapable of thinking clearly. Hopefully now you have a really clear understanding that that's not the case, that for most people, even in late adulthood, their cognitive capacities stay really stable across the lifespan. So a person, for example, I see this a lot, that like just in the neighborhood or in a community or at the store, someone who's older is trying to say, talk to a cashier or talk to someone else, and then is not able to hear a response very well because their physical capacity of hearing is lower. The person speaks or acts or talks in a way or talks behind their back in a way that shows that just because they can't hear well, they assume they can't think well also. And that's not the case. Older adults are very capable of thinking clearly, of using fluid intelligence, and things like that. So ageism, not great. Also, there's the assumption that they can't hold responsible jobs. This is one thing that we've talked about in middle adulthood as well. One reason sometimes that companies, as well as the economic reasons for pushing out older employees from positions and not hiring older employees as well. Even though we saw the stats last time that older employees tend to have less accidents, tend to miss work less, have high satisfaction, and in some spheres outperform younger workers as well. So also there's the perception that older adults don't enjoy sex. And when we look at the stats breakdown, I think we looked at that in middle adulthood last, at every age, there's still a significant number of people who are engaged in sex weekly, monthly, yearly. So that is a perception that exists, that older people don't enjoy sex, when in fact it still is a high percentage of older adults who do. And then also that they can't necessarily contribute to their community. And I think looking at that video example of the person who created a organization, what was it called? Prima or Pima, they're very involved in their community. They can contribute. So these are some things that are assumptions made of older people because of ageism. We probably won't get to it today, but this is compounded when there's other stereotypes as well. So if there's stereotypes based on their ethnicity or their socioeconomic status or their gender, all these things together, you might have heard this referred to as intersectionality, that all these compounding stereotypes can lead to worse outcomes or more challenges for an individual. So just wanted to kind of prime for that, so because we'll discuss that probably next time. So here we've also got concerns economically about older people. like the videos we're talking about, there are more and more older people getting older all the time. And so the population of elderly people is larger. So healthcare is a big concern there. A lot of older people are suffering from multiple chronic diseases, and that takes a lot of healthcare. So regular visits, regular kinds of treatments, depends on what it is, but a lot more than you might expect from an early adult, on average again. So the cost of healthcare for older adults tends to be higher. So what can we do about that? Well, policy researchers, evaluation, medical research, there's a lot of things that suggest some things that we can do to help older people. This is also related to elder care. So the physical and emotional care that elders need, whether it's in nursing home, a family, just general elder care, a live-in nurse, a person who visits and gives prescriptions every once in a while. So caretaking, as well as being a new context for the older adult, can be challenging for the caretakers themselves. So an ageism can make that more challenging, can lead to difficulties there. If you're not expecting that an older person is capable of things, like we talked about last time, you might be trying to do more for that person than they actually need, and inadvertently shortening their life or giving them a lower quality of life. All right, here, technology pros and cons. Yeah, we can get through this and probably stop right after this, I think, based on the time for class. So technology for late adults has some pros as well as some cons. So one of the biggest positives of technology is that it reduces the likelihood of being depressed by 1/3. And the main reason for this is because the connection with neighbors takes a lot less physical activity when you're able to do like a video call. So you can do a Skype or a FaceTime call or something like that. When you can use a smartphone and the internet to contact with your family and friends, your well-being will be higher than not. A really good example of this is a grandparent in my own family near the beginning of the pandemic was given an iPad essentially by the family to be able to connect with other people. So it was definitely a challenge, like helping them learn how to use it when had to be socially distanced from them, trying to get them to use it, and while they were using it, telling them how to use it, what to like hang-ups of calls and things like that. But a really good way for people to stay in contact, especially people who are older, who might have limited mobility, not be able to drive their own cars possibly, less ability to walk around. So that is a big improvement. So a big pro for technology. A big con for technology is that adults 65 and older, on average, watch about 51 hours and 32 minutes of TV a week. So with that, the big problem with this is that they're sedentary during this. It's not active, they're not involved, they're not socializing, it's generally not using their cognitive capacities. So just like with a young child, you want them to watch like educational TV, be interactive with it, things like that. I mean, that would be, if they're going to watch TV, something more interactive is going to be better for older adults, or just doing things that are more physical and less sedentary. So technology does make it easier to be more sedentary, and that is a big con of technology for older adults. When being physically, cognitively, mentally, and emotionally active is such a big component of staying healthy and thriving. It's better to be doing those things and living rather than just watching TV. So those are some of the biggest points I want to make before we jump into families and social relationships. There's not really good places to stop throughout this, so I think we'll actually end there for today. So thank you for being here today. Happy Earth Day. I hope you have a good one and do something good for the earth. We're going to plant some sunflowers for my kids. Honestly, we've been planting all our gardens for the last month, 2 months, something like that. So I feel like we've done some good earth things, but we'll do some more today too. So have a good Earth Day. Thank you for being here, and I will see you next Tuesday.
Thanks.